Mexican cartels raids veteran's farm, unaware he's the deadly Delta Force's commander in history. The farm was his sanctuary, after a 30-year career in the U.S. Army's elite Delta Force, culminating in command of the entire unit. Art had retreated to this quiet corner of the world. He'd inherited the land from his father, a World War II veteran who had instilled in him a love for the land and a deep respect for hard work. Art found solace in the rhythm of farm life, the early mornings, the honest labor, the connection to the earth. He raised a small herd of cattle, kept a flock of chickens, and tended a large vegetable garden that provided most of his food. He wasn't completely isolated. He had a few close friends in the nearby town of Havenwood, a place where everyone knew everyone and gossip traveled faster than the creek that snaked through the valley. He occasionally helped out at the local hardware store, owned by his friend, Jed, a younger veteran who'd served in Iraq. Jed looked up to Art, and Art enjoyed the quiet camaraderie. His days were simple, predictable, and profoundly satisfying. He'd wake before dawn, make coffee, and watch the sunrise paint the sky with vibrant colors. He'd tend to his animals, work in his garden, and then spend the afternoons reading on the porch or tinkering in his workshop. He was a skilled woodworker, crafting furniture and small toys that he often donated to the local church for their annual charity auction. There were ghosts, of course. Memories of missions in distant lands, of comrades lost, of the brutal realities of war. They came to him mostly at night, in the quiet darkness, but Art had learned to live with them. He'd built a wall around that part of his life, a fortress of solitude and routine that kept the demons at bay. He never spoke of his time in Delta Force, not even to Jed. It was a closed chapter, a book he'd carefully placed on a high shelf, out of reach. The farmhouse itself was a reflection of Art's life, sturdy, simple, and filled with the echoes of the past. It was a two-story structure built of weathered wood and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around to sides. Inside, the furniture was old but well-maintained, the floors covered with hand-woven rugs. Family photos adorned the walls, a testament to generations of Macmillans who had worked this land. One particular photo held a place of honor above the fireplace, a young Art Macmillan in his army uniform, standing tall and proud, with a hint of the steely determination in his eyes that would later define his career. He rarely looked at it, but it was a reminder of who he had been, a silent sentinel guarding the life he had chosen now. The only hint of his past life, subtly woven into his present, was his meticulous organization. Everything in his workshop was in its place, tools cleaned and sharpened. His garden was laid out with military precision, each row perfectly straight. Even his pantry was stocked with a strategic reserve of supplies, a habit ingrained from years of planning for the unexpected. It was a part of him he couldn't, and perhaps didn't want to, completely shed. It was a part of his core identity. He enjoyed the occasional visit from Sarah, the town librarian, a kind, intelligent woman in her late 60s. They shared a love of books and quiet conversation, and Sarah often brought him freshly baked pies. There was a gentle, unspoken understanding between them, a companionship built on shared loneliness and a mutual respect for each other's privacy. She knew he had a past he didn't talk about, and she never pried. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light across the farm, Art finished his coffee and set the mug down on the porch railing. He took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, the scent of earth and wild flowers filling his lungs. It was a good life, a peaceful life, a life he had earned, but the peace, he sensed, was about to be shattered. He just didn't know it yet. He looked out across his property, and in the distance he saw the dust rising from the dirt road that was the only way in or out of his land. Someone was coming, and from his years of experience, fast approaching vehicles on roads they shouldn't be using usually meant one thing: trouble. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving itself into a pair of black SUVs, moving at a speed far too fast for the winding country road. Art watched them with a growing unease, his hand instinctively moving to his side, where a sidearm would have been holstered decades ago. He hadn't carried a weapon regularly since his retirement, but the muscle memory remained. The SUVs screeched to a halt in front of his property, the drivers ignoring the no trespassing sign posted clearly on the fence. For men emerged, their faces hard, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. They wore expensive-looking clothes that seemed out of place in the rural setting. Art recognized the type: arrogance, entitlement, and a blatant disregard for the law. He walked down the porch steps, his movements slow but deliberate, meeting them at the fence line. He didn't speak, simply waited, his blue eyes fixed on the man who appeared to be the leader. The man, who had a thin, cruel-looking scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, smirked. "Mr. McMillan," he said, his voice thick with a Mexican accent. "We've heard a lot about you." "I doubt that," Art replied, his voice calm and even. "I keep to myself. That's what we're here to discuss. This isolation of yours. It's not good for business." "I'm not in business," Art said, his gaze unwavering. "Everyone's in business, old man. One way or another." The leader gestured vaguely towards the surrounding countryside. "This land, it's valuable. Strategic. We need it." Art knew instantly what business they were in. The whispers had been circulating through Havenwood for months. A Mexican cartel, the Sombras, was expanding its operations into the area, buying up land, intimidating farmers, and establishing a foothold for their drug trafficking network. He'd hoped it was just rumor, but the reality was now standing before him. "This land is not for sale," Art said, his voice hardening slightly. The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Everything has a price, old man, and we're willing to pay, or take." The other men shifted, their hands moving subtly towards their waistbands. Art didn't flinch. He'd faced down far more dangerous men in far more precarious situations. "I suggest you leave," Art said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." The leader's smirk widened. "You think you can stop us? You're one old man, living alone. We are many. I've dealt with many before," Art replied, his eyes narrowing. The memories, the ones he usually kept locked away, began to surface. The heat of the desert, the chaos of battle, the faces of his fallen comrades. He pushed them back, focusing on the present threat. "We'll be back, Mr. McMillan," the leader said, turning to leave. "And next time, we won't be so polite." The SUVs roared back down the road, leaving Art standing in a cloud of dust. He watched them go, his mind already racing, calculating, planning. He knew this was just the beginning. The Sombras wouldn't give up easily. They'd underestimated him, of course. They saw an old farmer, a relic of a bygone era. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He went back inside the house, his peaceful morning shattered. He walked to the photo above the fireplace, the one of his younger self in uniform. He stared at it for a long moment, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The soldier was still there, buried beneath the layers of time and tranquility. And the soldier was about to be awakened. He went to the basement, to a locked room that he hadn't opened in years. Inside, there were no weapons, no trophies of war. Just a collection of maps, old training manuals, and a few seemingly innocuous items. A spool of fishing line, a box of nails, a roll of duct tape. The tools of a farmer, yes, but also the tools of a man who knew how to turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. He started making a detailed survey of his land, identifying choke points, natural barriers, and potential ambush sites. He wasn't planning to fight a war, he was planning to defend his home. And he would do it with the cunning and precision that had made him a legend in the Delta Force. The next few days were filled with an uneasy quiet. Art went about his chores, but his senses were on high alert. He slept lightly, his ears attuned to any unusual sounds. He varied his routine, avoiding predictable patterns. He knew the Sombras were watching him, waiting for an opportunity. He found small signs of their presence, tire tracks on the edge of his property, a broken branch near his fence, a strange scent in the air that he couldn't quite place. They were testing him, probing his defenses, trying to get under his skin. He ignored them, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Then, one evening, as he was finishing his supper, he heard the unmistakable sound of his cattle bellowing in distress. He rushed outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He found one of his cows lying on the ground, its leg caught in a crudely made snare trap. The wire had cut deep into the flesh, and the animal was in obvious pain. Art knelt beside the cow, his hands gentle as he examined the wound. He spoke to her in soothing tones, calming her fear. He carefully removed the snare, his anger simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just a threat, it was a deliberate act of cruelty, designed to provoke him. He knew he couldn't let it stand. He couldn't allow the Sombras to terrorize him and his animals. He treated the cow's wound, his movements precise and efficient. As he worked, he made a decision. He would no longer wait for them to come to him. He would take the fight to them. He spent the rest of the night preparing. He didn't have guns, but he had other resources. He used his knowledge of the land, his understanding of tactics, and his ingenuity to create a series of deterrents. He set up tripwires connected to noisemakers, fashioned improvised alarms from tin cans and string, and strategically placed obstacles in the areas where the Sombras were most likely to approach. He didn't intend to kill anyone. His goal was to disrupt their operations, to make them think twice about targeting his farm. He wanted to send a message that he was not an easy target, that he would not be intimidated. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Art surveyed his handiwork. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He was ready. He knew they would come back, probably under the cover of darkness. He would be waiting. He went inside, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise. He felt a strange sense of calm, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet focus of a soldier preparing for battle. He wasn't afraid. He was determined. He would protect his home, his land, his way of life. He would show the Sombras what it meant to mess with a retired Delta Force commander. The fight he didn't want, but was forced into, was about to begin. And the cartel members who thought he was just an old man in the middle of nowhere were about to be very, very surprised. After tending to his injured cow, Art knew he couldn't stand idle by. His first instinct, honed by years of discipline, was to follow procedure. He wouldn't resort to vigilante justice without exploring the official channels. He drove into Havenwood, his old pickup truck rumbling down the familiar roads. He went straight to the sheriff's office, a small, unassuming building that had seen better days. Sheriff Brody was a middle-aged man, overweight and weary, with a perpetually defeated expression. He'd been sheriff for as long as Art could remember, more of a figurehead than a crime fighter. Havenwood had always been a peaceful town, until recently. Art, Brody greeted him, a hint of surprise in his voice. "What brings you in?" Art explained the situation, describing the threats from the Sombras, the injured cow, and the clear signs of trespassing on his property. He spoke calmly and concisely, laying out the facts without embellishment. Brody listened, his face growing increasingly pale. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Art, I hear you," he said, his voice laced with resignation. "But there's not much I can do. The Sombras, they're powerful. They have people everywhere. Even in my own department, I suspect." Art wasn't surprised. He'd sensed the corruption, the fear that had gripped the town. It was a classic tactic of organized crime: infiltrate and control local law enforcement, either through bribery or intimidation. "So, you're just going to let them run wild?" Art asked, his voice still even, but with a hint of steel beneath it. "I'm not saying that," Brody said defensively. "I'm saying we need to be careful. We need to gather evidence, build a case. We can't just go charging in there without a plan." "They're already charging in," Art countered. "They're on my land, hurting my animals, threatening my life. How much more evidence do you need?" Brody avoided his gaze. "Look, I'll send a deputy out to your place, take a look around. But I can't promise anything. These guys are dangerous, Art. They play for keeps." "I know how they play," Art said quietly, his mind flashing back to countless missions in hostile territories. "I've played that game before." Brody looked at him, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps pity, in his eyes. "Just be careful, Art. Don't do anything rash." Art nodded, knowing that the sheriff's offer was a token gesture, a way to appease him without actually doing anything substantial. He left the office, feeling a profound sense of isolation. He was on his own. He drove to the local FBI field office, a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. He spoke to Agent Miller, a young, ambitious agent who seemed genuinely concerned about the situation. Art laid out the same facts he'd presented to Sheriff Brody, emphasizing the growing threat the Sombras posed to the entire region. Miller listened attentively, taking notes. He asked detailed questions, probing for any information that might be useful. Unlike Brody, he didn't seem intimidated by the cartel's reputation. "Mr. McMillan, this is serious," Miller said, his brow furrowed. "We've been tracking the Sombras' activities for months, but we haven't been able to get enough concrete evidence to make a move. Your testimony could be very helpful." Art felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he wasn't entirely alone after all. "I'm willing to cooperate fully," Art said. "I can provide you with details about their movements, their vehicles, and the individuals I encountered." "That's good to hear," Miller said. "But I need to be upfront with you. This is a complex investigation. It involves multiple jurisdictions, and it's going to take time. We need to build a solid case, something that will stand up in court." "Time is something I don't have a lot of," Art said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They're escalating their attacks. I can't just sit here and wait for them to make the next move." Miller nodded understandingly. "I understand your concern, mister. Macmillan, but we need to do this by the book. We can't risk jeopardizing the entire investigation by acting prematurely. He offered Art a business card. Keep me informed of any further developments. And please, be careful. Don't engage with these people directly. Let us handle it. Art took the card, but he knew that Miller's hands were tied. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and the Sombras were moving fast. He thanked Miller for his time and left the office, feeling even more disillusioned than before. He realized that the system, designed to protect citizens, was failing him. The local police were compromised, and the federal authorities were hampered by bureaucracy and the need for overwhelming evidence. He was caught in a no-man's land, facing a ruthless enemy with no one to turn to. As he drove back to his farm, a sense of grim determination settled over him. He had tried the proper channels, followed the rules, and it had led him nowhere. He was a soldier, trained to adapt and overcome. He had been forced into a corner, and now he would have to rely on his own skills, his own instincts, to survive. He stopped at Yet's hardware store on his way home. Jed, seeing the look on Art's face, didn't ask any questions. He simply nodded and led him to the back of the store, where he kept a few items that weren't on display. I figured you might be needing some supplies, Jed said, his voice low. Art examined the items: rolls of heavy-duty wire, pressure-sensitive alarms, motion detectors, and other seemingly innocuous materials that, in the right hands, could be used for more than just home repairs. Thanks, Jed, Art said, a faint smile playing on his lips. This is exactly what I need. Jed didn't ask for an explanation. He knew Art well enough to understand that he was facing something dangerous, something he couldn't talk about. He simply rang up the purchase, his eyes conveying a silent message of support. As Art drove the final stretch to his farm, he felt a shift in his mindset. He was no longer a retired farmer seeking help from a broken system. He was a warrior, preparing for battle. He was going back to his roots, to the skills and instincts that had kept him alive in countless conflicts. He was ready to defend his home, his land, and his life. The Sombras had made a grave mistake. They had awakened a sleeping giant. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the fields. Art sat on his porch, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. He held a worn, leather-bound journal in his lap, a relic from his days in Delta Force. It contained notes, sketches, and reflections from countless missions, a record of a life lived on the edge. He hadn't opened the journal in years. It was a reminder of a past he had tried to leave behind, a world of violence and uncertainty. But now, that world had come crashing back into his peaceful existence. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing the faded ink. He saw diagrams of complex tactical maneuvers, lists of equipment and supplies, and observations on human behavior under pressure. He stopped at a page with a single, stark sentence written in bold letters. When all else fails, rely on your training. It was a mantra that had been drilled into him from his earliest days in the military. It was a principle that had saved his life countless times. He closed the journal, his decision made. He couldn't rely on anyone else. He had to rely on himself, on the skills and experience he had honed over a lifetime of service. He would not be a victim. He would not surrender his home to these criminals. He stood up, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He went inside the house and walked to the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the photo of his younger self. He saw the determination in those young eyes, the unwavering commitment to duty. He felt a surge of that same determination, a fire rekindled in his heart. He went to his bedroom and opened a hidden compartment in the floor, beneath a loose floorboard. Inside, there was no arsenal of weapons, just a few carefully selected items, a compass, a map of the surrounding area, a first aid kit, and a small, unassuming box. He opened the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of cotton, was a single object, his old Delta Force Challenge coin. It was a symbol of his membership in an elite unit, a reminder of the rigorous training, the shared sacrifices, and the unwavering loyalty that bound them together. He held the coin in his hand, feeling its weight, its significance. It was a tangible link to his past, a source of strength and inspiration. He closed his eyes, remembering the faces of his comrades, the men he had fought alongside, the men who had trusted him with their lives. He knew what he had to do. He would not engage in a reckless, all-out war with the Sombras. He would not stoop to their level of brutality. He would use his intelligence, his training, and his knowledge of the land to outmaneuver them, to disrupt their operations and to send a clear message that he would not be intimidated. He would fight a different kind of war, a war of wits and strategy, a war where the advantage went not to the strongest, but to the smartest. He would use the principles of asymmetric warfare, turning his weaknesses into strengths, exploiting their vulnerabilities, and making them pay a price for every inch of ground they tried to take. He spent the rest of the evening planning, meticulously reviewing the maps, studying the terrain, and anticipating the somberest likely moves. He wasn't just defending his farm, he was defending his way of life, his values, and the memory of every soldier who had ever fought for freedom and justice. He knew the risks. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a ruthless enemy. But he also knew that he had something the sombrest didn't: the unwavering resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who was willing to fight for what he believed in, even if it meant sacrificing everything. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the farm, Art McMillan, the retired Delta Force commander, prepared to go to war. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a warrior, awakened from his slumber, ready to defend his home and his honor. The decision was made. The die was cast. The battle was about to begin. The next morning, Art began his preparations in earnest. He wasn't building a fortress. He was transforming his farm into a carefully orchestrated series of deterrents and traps designed not to kill, but to disorient, delay, and demoralize the enemy. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements precise and economical, every action guided by years of training and experience. He started by surveying the perimeter of his property, identifying the most likely approach routes. He used his knowledge of the terrain, the natural contours of the land, and the existing vegetation to his advantage. He didn't need to build walls. He would use nature's own defenses. He strung nearly invisible fishing line across narrow paths, connecting them to clusters of empty tin cans filled with pebbles. The slightest disturbance would trigger a rattling alarm, alerting him to the intruder's presence. He scattered caltrops, small, four-pronged metal devices designed to puncture tires, along the dirt road leading to his house, concealing them beneath a thin layer of dust and leaves. He reinforced the fences around his property, not with barbed wire, but with tightly woven wire mesh, making it difficult to climb over or cut through. He placed motion-activated sprinklers in strategic locations, not to water the lawn, but to create muddy patches and slippery surfaces, hindering movement and disorienting anyone caught in their spray. He used his woodworking skills to craft a series of simple but effective booby traps. He built tripwires connected to spring-loaded devices that would release a cloud of flour or pepper, temporarily blinding and irritating anyone who triggered them. He fashioned noisemakers from old farm equipment, creating a cacophony of sounds that would echo across the fields, disorienting the intruders and masking his own movements. He didn't neglect his own physical preparation. He started each day with a rigorous exercise routine, pushing his aging body to its limits. He practiced his hand-to-hand combat skills, using a makeshift dummy he constructed from hay bales and old clothes. He sharpened his senses, spending hours observing the landscape, training his eyes to detect the slightest anomaly, his ears to discern the faintest sound. He also prepared himself mentally. He revisited his old training manuals, studying the principles of psychological warfare, learning how to exploit the enemy's fears and anxieties. He meditated, focusing his mind, clearing away the clutter of everyday thoughts, and sharpening his concentration. He knew that his greatest weapon was not his physical strength, but his mind. He would outthink his opponents, anticipate their moves, and use their own aggression against them. He would turn their arrogance into a liability, their confidence into a weakness. He worked tirelessly, day and night, transforming his peaceful farm into a subtle but deadly obstacle course. He didn't see it as a preparation for violence. He saw it as a defense of his home, a testament to his resilience, a way to reclaim his peace of mind. He was careful to conceal his preparations, making sure everything looked natural, as if it were part of the everyday landscape. He didn't want to alert the sombers prematurely. He wanted them to walk into his trap unsuspecting, confident in their superiority. As he worked, he felt a sense of purpose, a renewed sense of vitality. He was no longer just an old man, living out his days in quiet solitude. He was a warrior, engaged in a battle for his survival, a battle he was determined to win. He knew he couldn't stop the sombers completely, but he could make them pay a heavy price for their aggression. He could make them regret the day they decided to target his farm. He could show them that even an old, retired soldier could still be a formidable opponent. The preparation was complete. The stage was set. The trap was sprung. All that remained was for the Sombras to make their move, and Art McMillan, the deadly Delta Force commander, would be ready. Night fell, a thick blanket of darkness enveloping the farm. Art sat in his darkened living room, his senses on high alert. He wasn't waiting passively. He was actively hunting, using his ears and eyes to penetrate the darkness, to anticipate the enemy's approach. He heard the faint crunch of gravel on the dirt road, the telltale sign of approaching vehicles. He didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon. He simply listened, calculating their speed, their direction, their numbers. The vehicles stopped a short distance from his property, their engines idling. He heard the muffled voices of men, speaking in Spanish. He recognized the voice of the leader, the man with the scar, giving orders. Art slipped out the back door, moving silently through the shadows. He knew the layout of his farm like the back of his hand, every tree, every fence post, every dip and rise in the terrain. He used the darkness to his advantage, becoming one with the night. He reached a vantage point overlooking the approach route, a small rise hidden by a thicket of trees. He saw the Sombras, 4 of them, moving cautiously towards his house, their weapons held at the ready. They were confident, arrogant, expecting an easy target. Art waited, his patience honed by years of experience. He let them get closer, drawing them deeper into his trap. He wanted to maximize the impact of his first strike. He watched as the lead man stepped on a pressure-sensitive plate hidden beneath a layer of leaves. A loud, piercing alarm shrieked through the night, shattering the silence. The Sombras froze, startled, their eyes darting around, trying to locate the source of the noise. Art triggered another alarm, this one connected to a series of flashing lights he had installed in the trees. The sudden burst of light disoriented the intruders, momentarily blinding them. He then activated the sprinklers, creating a muddy, slippery patch in their path. One of the men stumbled, losing his footing and falling to the ground. The others hesitated, unsure of what to do. Art used the confusion to his advantage. He moved quickly and silently, setting off a series of noisemakers he had placed strategically around the perimeter. The air filled with a cacophony of sounds, clanging metal, rattling cans, and the shrill blast of an air horn. The Sombras were completely disoriented, their senses overwhelmed. They couldn't see, they couldn't hear, they couldn't tell where the threats were coming from. They started firing their weapons blindly, their bullets striking trees and fences, wasting their ammunition. Art remained calm, his movements precise and controlled. He wasn't trying to engage them in a firefight. He was trying to disrupt their attack, to sow chaos and confusion, to make them question their own sanity. He watched as the leader, his face contorted with rage and frustration, tried to regain control of his men. He shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the noise. The other men were clearly panicked, their confidence shattered. Art knew he had achieved his objective. He had turned their attack into a farce, their strength into a weakness. He had shown them that he was not an easy target, that he was prepared to defend his home with every ounce of his cunning and skill. He retreated back to the house, leaving the Sombras to stumble around in the darkness, their attack thwarted, their pride wounded. He knew they would be back, angrier and more determined than before. But he would be ready. He had won the first round, but the battle was far from over. He had sent a message, loud and clear. This old man was not to be trifled with. This farm was not theirs for the taking. The next day, Art assessed the damage. The Sombras had left in a hurry, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Bullet holes in trees, trampled fences, and a general sense of chaos. But they hadn't breached his inner defenses. They hadn't reached his house, his animals, or him. He knew they would be back, and they would be more cautious, more prepared. He used the daylight hours to repair the damage, to reinforce his defenses, and to adapt his tactics. He anticipated their next move, trying to think like them, to understand their motivations and their methods. He knew they would likely try a different approach, perhaps attacking from multiple directions, or using heavier weaponry. He adjusted his traps and alarms accordingly, creating new obstacles and diversions. He was playing a deadly game of chess, and he was determined to stay one step ahead. As night fell, he felt the familiar tension, the heightened awareness that came with the anticipation of battle. He was not afraid, he was focused. He was ready to defend his home, to protect his way of life. He heard the sound of vehicles approaching, but this time, it was different. There were more of them, and they were moving slower, more deliberately. He also heard the distinct sound of a helicopter, circling overhead. The Sombras had escalated the conflict. Art moved to a concealed position, watching as the vehicles stopped a safe distance from his property. The men who emerged were different this time. They were more heavily armed, wearing body armor and carrying sophisticated communication equipment. They were no longer just thugs, they were trained mercenaries. The helicopter provided air support, its searchlight sweeping across the fields, illuminating the terrain. Art knew he was at a disadvantage. He couldn't match their firepower, and he couldn't hide from the helicopter. He had to use his wits, his knowledge of the land, to his advantage. He triggered a series of smoke bombs he had prepared, creating a thick cloud of smoke that obscured the ground, hindering the helicopter's visibility. He then activated a network of hidden speakers, playing recordings of gunfire and explosions, creating the illusion of a larger, more heavily armed force. The Sombras hesitated, confused by the smoke and the sounds. They were unsure of what they were facing. They had expected an old man, living alone. They were encountering a sophisticated defense system. Art used the confusion to his advantage. He moved silently through the shadows, using his knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver them. He set off a series of tripwires, triggering noisemakers and blinding flashes of light. He didn't engage them directly, he harassed them, disrupted their movements, and made them question their own safety. He was a ghost, a phantom, an invisible force that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The helicopter, hampered by the smoke and the confusing sounds, was unable to provide effective support. The mercenaries on the ground were frustrated. Their attack stalled. They were firing blindly, wasting their ammunition, achieving nothing. Art knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and eventually, they would find him. He needed to change his tactics. He needed to find a way to level the playing field. He had anticipated this escalation, and he had a plan. It was risky, audacious, and relied on precise timing and execution. But it was his best chance to turn the tide of the battle. He retreated towards his barn, a large, sturdy structure that he had subtly reinforced. He had created a hidden escape route, a narrow tunnel that led from the basement of the barn to a concealed exit in the nearby woods. It was his last resort, his escape hatch if things went wrong. As the mercenaries closed in on the barn, Art triggered a final series of distractions. He activated a remote-controlled device that sent a herd of his cattle stampeding across the field, creating a diversion and further confusing the attackers. He set off a series of small, controlled explosions using fertilizer and diesel fuel, creating the illusion of a much larger, more powerful explosive device. The mercenaries, believing they had him cornered, stormed the barn, their weapons blazing. They found it empty, except for the lingering smell of smoke and the echoes of the explosions. They had been tricked. Art, meanwhile, had slipped through the hidden tunnel, emerging in the woods undetected. He moved quickly and silently, circling back towards the main road, where the Sombras vehicles were parked. He had a specific target in mind, the helicopter. He knew that if he could disable the helicopter, he would significantly reduce their advantage. He had no illusions about shooting it down, he simply needed to ground it, to render it useless. He reached the road, concealing himself in the shadows. He saw the helicopter sitting idle, its pilot waiting for instructions. He also saw the mercenaries guarding the vehicles, their attention focused on the barn. Art moved with the speed and agility of a much younger man. He used the darkness and the surrounding vegetation to his advantage, closing the distance between himself and the guards. He took them down quickly and silently, using his hands and feet, his years of combat training coming back to him in a rush of adrenaline. He reached the helicopter, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had only a few minutes before the other mercenaries realized what was happening. He examined the aircraft, his eyes scanning for its vulnerabilities. He didn't need to destroy it, he just needed to disable it. He found what he was looking for, the tail rotor, a small but crucial component that controlled the helicopter's stability. He used a heavy-duty wrench he had taken from his workshop to damage the rotor, bending the blades and jamming the mechanism. He then retreated back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. He heard the shouts of the mercenaries as they discovered the disabled helicopter, their frustration and anger echoing through the night. He had struck a significant blow, turning their technological advantage against them. He knew this was only a temporary victory. The Sombras would be even more enraged, more determined to hunt him down. But he had bought himself some time, and he had shown them that he was not an easy prey. He had escalated the conflict, not with brute force, but with cunning and intelligence. He was a warrior, fighting a desperate battle for survival, and he would not give up. He was playing the long game, knowing that even the smallest victories could add up, eventually forcing the cartel to realize he wasn't worth the trouble. The Sombras' attack had been repelled, but Art knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They were like a wounded animal, cornered and desperate. They would come back, and they would come back with everything they had. He had to be ready. He spent the remaining hours of the night preparing for what he knew would be the final showdown. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep evading them forever. He had to make a stand, to confront them directly, but on his own terms. He chose his battleground carefully. He selected a small clearing near the center of his property, a place where he had a clear view of the surrounding area, but also offered some natural cover. He reinforced the perimeter with a series of improvised obstacles, using fallen trees, barbed wire, and anything else he could find. He didn't have conventional weapons, but he had his ingenuity, his knowledge of the land, and his years of combat training. He fashioned a series of traps, using simple but effective mechanisms, tripwires connected to noisemakers, concealed pits filled with sharpened stakes not deep enough to kill, but enough to injure and incapacitate, and strategically placed obstacles designed to slow down and disorient the attackers. He knew his limitations. He was one man, against many. He couldn't win a straight-up firefight. He had to use his wits, his cunning, to outsmart his opponents. He had to turn their strengths against them, to exploit their weaknesses, to make them pay a heavy price for every inch of ground they gained. As dawn approached, he positioned himself in the clearing, his senses on high alert. He was calm, focused, his mind clear of all distractions. He was a warrior, preparing for his final battle. He was ready to face his destiny. He heard the sound of vehicles approaching, the roar of engines, and the shouts of men. The Sombras were back, and they were not holding back. They came from multiple directions, their weapons firing, their intent clear, to kill or capture him, to end this once and for all. Art remained hidden, letting them come to him. He waited patiently, his finger on the trigger of a makeshift device he had created, a series of interconnected slingshots, loaded with small, but painful, projectiles, hardened clay balls. As the first wave of mercenaries entered the clearing, Art unleashed his barrage. The clay balls struck them with surprising force, causing pain and confusion. They stumbled, their advance faltering. Art then triggered a series of noisemakers, creating a deafening cacophony that disoriented the attackers. He used the smoke from strategically placed smoke bombs to obscure their vision, making it difficult for them to target him. He moved quickly and silently, using the natural cover to his advantage. He appeared and disappeared, firing his slingshot, setting off traps, harassing the enemy from all directions. He was a ghost, a phantom, an invisible force that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The mercenaries, frustrated and disoriented, fired blindly, their bullets striking trees and rocks, wasting their ammunition. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. The leader of the Sombras, the man with the scar, was enraged. He shouted orders, trying to regain control of his men, but his voice was lost in the chaos. He had underestimated his opponent, and now he was paying the price. Art continued his relentless assault, his movements precise and economical, his mind focused on the task at hand. He was not fighting for glory or for revenge. He was fighting for survival, for his home, for his way of life. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He was tiring, his body aching, his resources dwindling. But he would not give up. He would fight until his last breath. The battle raged on, a chaotic dance of death and defiance. Art, the old soldier, the retired farmer, was proving to be a formidable opponent, a force to be reckoned with. He was a testament to the power of the human spirit, the unwavering will to survive. The Sombras had thought they were dealing with a weak, vulnerable old man. They were wrong. They were dealing with a legend, and legends never die easily. He knew that this final confrontation would determine everything. He would either succeed in making his farm too costly for them to bother with, or he wouldn't survive the day. The battle reached its peak. Art, despite his age and lack of conventional weaponry, had managed to hold off the Sombras for a surprisingly long time. But he was tiring, his movements becoming slower, his reactions less sharp. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. He had inflicted significant casualties, not fatal, but enough to disrupt their attack and sow chaos among their ranks. The mercenaries were frustrated, their initial confidence shattered. They had expected an easy victory, they had encountered a nightmare. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden light across the battlefield, Art saw his opportunity. He had noticed a pattern in the Sombris movements, a weakness in their formation. They were bunching up, concentrating their firepower in one area, leaving themselves vulnerable to a flanking maneuver. He gathered his remaining strength, his resolve hardening. He would make one final, desperate push. He would either break their attack, or he would fall. He used his last remaining smoke bombs to create a screen, concealing his movements. He then moved quickly and silently, circling around the mercenaries, using the trees and the undergrowth to his advantage. He reached their flank, undetected. He took a deep breath, focusing his mind, channeling all his remaining energy into one final assault. He emerged from the smoke, his makeshift slingshot firing a barrage of clay balls. He targeted the leader, the man with the scar, the one who had started all this. He struck him multiple times, causing him to stumble and fall, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the ground. The other mercenaries, surprised and disoriented, turned to face him, but it was too late. Art had disrupted their attack, broken their momentum. They hesitated, unsure of what to do. At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air. The cavalry had arrived, finally. Agent Miller, having been alerted by Jed, who'd grown increasingly worried about Art's purchases and lack of contact, had finally pieced together the situation and mobilized a team of federal agents. They arrived in force, their vehicles surrounding the clearing, their weapons drawn. The Sombris, seeing that they were outnumbered and outgunned, surrendered. They were taken into custody, their weapons confiscated, their reign of terror brought to an end. Art, exhausted but alive, watched as the agents secured the scene. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, a sense of closure. He had survived. He had defended his home. He had won. Miller approached him, his face a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mr. Macmillan, are you all right?" Art nodded, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine, Agent Miller. Just a little tired." Miller looked around at the scene of the battle, at the improvised traps, the makeshift weapons, the evidence of a fierce and desperate struggle. He shook his head in disbelief. "You did all this by yourself?" he asked. Art smiled, a faint, weary smile. "I had some help. From the land, from my training, from the ghosts of my past." The aftermath was a blur of activity. The injured mercenaries were treated. The remaining Sombris were transported to a federal detention center, and Art's farm was declared a crime scene. Art cooperated fully with the authorities, providing them with a detailed account of the events. He was hailed as a hero, a symbol of resilience and courage. The media descended upon Havenwood, eager to tell his story. But Art shunned the spotlight. He had no desire for fame or recognition. He just wanted to return to his quiet life, to the peace and tranquility of his farm. After the investigation was completed, and the Sombris were indicted on a long list of charges, Art was finally left alone. He spent his days repairing the damage to his property, tending to his animals, and rebuilding his life. The community of Havenwood rallied around him, offering their support and gratitude. They had been living in fear of the Sombris, and Art had given them hope, had shown them that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was possible to fight back. Sarah, the librarian, visited him often, bringing him books and freshly baked pies. Their friendship deepened, their bond strengthened by the shared experience of adversity. Jed, his friend from the hardware store, helped him with the repairs, his silent presence a constant source of comfort and support. Art never fully recovered from the ordeal. He carried the scars of the battle, both physical and emotional, but he had also found a new sense of purpose, a renewed appreciation for life. He had faced his demons, confronted his past, and emerged victorious. He had proven that even an old, retired soldier could still make a difference, could still stand up for what he believed in. He returned to his quiet routine, his days filled with the simple pleasures of farm life. He watched the sunrises, tended his garden, and read his books. He had found peace, not in the absence of conflict, but in the resolution of it. The farm was once again his sanctuary, a place of refuge, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. He had defended it, protected it, and now he could finally enjoy it. The deadly Delta Force commander had returned to being a farmer, but he knew, and the world now knew, that the warrior still lived within him, and that was enough. The legend lived on, quietly, peacefully, in the heart of rural America. The cartel had made a grave mistake, and they, and many like them, would never underestimate a quiet, elderly American again.